This is Louise Zimmer with another story from our pioneer past. In September of 1785, a young Connecticut fellow, Joseph Buell, began a journey and a diary, both of which were to lead him to the farthest known frontier, which at that time was a vast expanse of territory west of the Ohio River. He was 25 years old that year, the son of Mary and David Buell, next to the eldest in their large family of 12 children. Not much else is known about Joe's early life, where or how long he went to school, or when or where he joined the Army. But when his journal begins, he is serving as orderly sergeant on his way to meet a company of 94 Army recruits bound for the border country. On this 20th day in the morning, he begins, set out for Hartford, rode as far as Durham, and sent back my horse. Why did he do that? Well, he doesn't explain, just goes on to say, then traveled on to Hartford on foot, arrived there at sunset. The soldiers collected themselves around me and seemed to be much pleased with my arrival, as I am to conduct them on to West Point. I took my lodging for the night at Murray's Tavern. They all left Hartford on the 22nd, marched 20 miles in the pouring rain, according to Joe, arrived in Washington, where he put up as many as possible at a small tavern and was able to find shelter for the rest of the men in neighboring houses. We were treated very kindly by the people of this town, he noted, but that 20-mile march in the pouring rain had taken its toll on at least one of his recruits. This evening I have had the mortification of having one of my men desert. And it gets worse. The landlord informed me that he missed a silver stock buckle. I cannot be persuaded that any of my men would steal from someone who had shown them kindness. Sergeant Buell orders a thorough search, and more mortification, I'm sure. The silver buckle, sure enough, it's found in the belongings of one of his fifers. So, what to do? Flog the fellow? That would have been the usual punishment. But since they had a lot of distance to cover, Joe decides against that. He reprimands the man, confiscates his pack, that is his belongings, to keep him from deserting, and continues relentlessly on the march toward West Point. He made note that the fellow is surly and sulky and most uncooperative. And Joe must have been relieved when, after 4 days on the move, they arrived at their destination on the 26th. We are keeping the men out of idleness in cleaning their arms and exercising, he writes, kind of hopefully. But all the while, they're adding new recruits, as many as possible. Now, the standards weren't high by any means. Being alive and upright and having a pulse was just about all that was asked. And Joe looked the men over with a critical eye. Vagabonds, that was his diagnosis. Vagabonds who will cause nothing but trouble. Part of this motley crew was assigned to Captain Strong's company, and others to Major Hamtramck's company, both of which belonged to Colonel Harmer's regiment. On November the 17th, Hamtramck's company was ready to begin the long trek west. His men, these men, are as blasted a set of villains as ever went unhung. That was Joe Buell's assessment of the Major's little army, and he still had his hands full with the ones that were left. Bear in mind now, these troops are all bound for the frontier to protect established law and order in the settlements to come. About this time, he begins to mention a fellow soldier, Levi Munsell, who's destined to be a lifelong friend and eventually a business partner. But on this cold, rainy autumn in 1785, he and Levi are occupied running down deserters and punishing them according to the rules in effect. We confine some, flog others, he notes rather matter-of-factly, and goes on to say, I have marched several nights to bring them back at the point of my cutlass. Now, bear in mind, Joe Buell's only about 25 years old at this time, and it would appear that he's already a pretty tough and somewhat cynical fellow, not to mention opportunistic. For example, during the 2 months he spent at West Point, he named at least a dozen soldiers who deserted. About half were found and brought back. The rest got away. In their eagerness to escape, the men usually left most of their belongings behind, and when they didn't come back to retrieve them, those possessions became the property of Sergeant Buell. This much must have been the usual custom. Doesn't seem to have been anything improper because he mentions it several times quite openly and casually, like on October 16th when he notes several desertions and adds with obvious satisfaction, "More to my pocket. I commonly make claim to all that is left by these deserters." Joe reminds me here, and we continue to see this characteristic all through his life, of a story I heard about a fellow bound for the frontier, and when someone asked him what he intended to do there, he replied, "Look after my own hide." That seemed to be Joe's chief mission, too. He wasn't one to take unnecessary risks. There's no record of any hairbreadth escapes or close calls of which he took part. On the other hand, when something had to be done, he did it. For example, the many times he recorded giving orders to have men flogged, now that means severely beaten, for some misdemeanor or other, no vindictiveness, but not much mercy either. And when an opportunity came his way, whether it was useful possessions left behind or some potentially lucrative business venture, he took it without hesitation. To sum it up, Joseph Buell was a survivor by nature, and that was a good characteristic to have in the dangerous frontier country of the late 18th century. Well, to get on with our story, as summer turned to fall that year, the fellows holed up at West Point, and they began to think rather optimistically that they would winter there in relative comfort. Surely they wouldn't be required to make the long, cold march west in the dead of winter. November the 17th arrived with the bad news, via the person of Major Willis. He would lead them west. When? In the spring? Why, no, right away, boys. Joe records glumly that we little expected that. And then on November 20th, we were mustered and reviewed, received our 2 months' pay, and embarked at 9 o'clock on board Captain Johnson's sloop for North Windsor. Nobody was happy about this. And with that 2 months' pay burning a hole in their pockets, we aren't surprised when the journal continues. A number of our men are quite drunk. The company arrived at North Windsor at daybreak, where Major Willis mercifully waited a day for the men to sober up before beginning the long trek west in winter. Our time is up for today, but please join me again next time and we'll continue this story. Joe Buell, soldier, lucky for us, journal keeper, and I'm not quite sure if I like this fellow, but gosh, he certainly is a survivor there in our pioneer past.